Okay guys, we're going to take a look here at the Populate deck that I put together. I like to start out here and just kind of go over it. I didn't decide this week that I was going to break down each test I did of this deck. I figured it would be better for me to just provide you guys with the final one, save us all a little bit of time. This was kind of an interesting thing for me because if you read the article there, you do see that I kind of debated whether or not Populate was a usable thing, and I know I said a lot in the past that it was just hands down not going to work, but after looking at it again and realizing that I could address some of the big issues that I thought the deck had or the mechanic itself had, maybe it could put together something that would be a viable contender. Now, one of the biggest issues I talked about is the fact that the mana is kind of wonky, and it's because of things like this. You look at Tristani's Judgment, you look at Horncaller's Chant, and Curses Accord, and these are three of the best Populate spells that we have available to us, but one of the issues with it is the fact that they all come in at very high costs. The Curses Accord is the cheapest, along with Tristani's Judgment, and these come in at 6. So in order to get Horncaller's Chant, you're going to be paying 8. And these are all well and good, but sometimes that can be a little bit much. And what I was ultimately thinking at first was that if you take the time to fill your deck with a whole bunch of mana ramp spells, what you're going to do ultimately is keep yourself from being able to be competitive, because you're going to be wasting a lot of spell slots on doing nothing but drawing lands. Thankfully, I did come to the realization that and kind of kicked myself afterwards, that you get a lot of input from these Cloud Posts and the Glimmer Posts, and they do generate a lot of mana, so Pauper does have the ability to generate the big mana needed to play these spells without having to load your deck up with a whole bunch of mana ramp. So we're going to be putting this into basically a Cloud Post shell. And it's something that, you think of Cloud Post and 8-post decks, you often think of a whole bunch of control decks, because we're very familiar with Izzet Control and Dimir Control and what impact they've had on the metagame. But there have been a couple of aggro-based strategies out there that have been favorable for competitive. The Rebels Post deck has really kind of died off, but that did work very well for a little while. One of the more popular aggro-based 8-post decks is going to be Green Post. And Mono Green Post is something that has not a lot of creatures, actually, but does use a lot of the big beefy bodies to get through and do a lot of damage. So I figured that was something we could do here as well, and almost, using not as much the fact that we have a lot of big creatures, or I'm sorry, a small amount of big creatures, but a lot of medium and good-sized creatures. I mean, if you look at Horncaller's Chant, that alone gives you a chance to put in 2 4/4 creatures. What you ultimately have to do with a spell like this is look at the Horncaller's Chant, and you are paying 8 mana for 2 4/4s, but playing a 4/4/4/4, that just sounds wrong. Let's look at Curses Accord, because maybe this will sound a little bit better. You're paying 6 for 2 3/3 tokens. Now, that is a lot at first, but if you break it down into individual creatures and consider paying 3 mana for a single 3/3 creature, then it doesn't look so bad. And you kind of ultimately have to consider it that way. And the same with Tristani's Judgment. You are paying a lot of mana to exile a creature, however, you are going to get the benefit that, 1, it's exiled, so that's great, they don't have an ability to get that back in any shape or form. And 2, that it gets you that Populate ability, and ideally will get you another 4/4 Rhino token. That would definitely be your advantage. So we are going to be using, an aggro strategy, and just, like I said, basing it off of the fact that we're going to be trying to generate a lot of tokens that are kind of hard to deal with. 3/3 is kind of your typical size in Pauper for a strong creature, and Horncaller's Chant is going to give us an ability to create a bigger creature in the 4/4 as well. So we're going to have a lot of fun with that. The deck is pretty standard when it comes to mana base. You are running, of course, the 8 Locust lands. Now, I debated over these lands here. I am running 2 copies of the Guildgate, as well as a single copy of the Sanctuary, which is the older Ravnica dual lands kind of that we had available to us. Now, what it came down to was this. I know that whether or not posts and guild gates go together is kind of a thing that I have talked about a lot and had issues with, but I think in a deck like this where you're waiting for a lot of mana anyways, you're not going to get slowed down too much with the double guild gates. The Sanctuary is something that I definitely wanted a single copy of because of life gain, and I really, if you're playing Izzet Post, you get that ability to capsize and ghostly flicker the Glimmer Post to get a little extra life gain out of it. And you don't get that if you're not playing blue, obviously. So what you can do is you can use these bounce lands from the past Ravnica block and use that to return the Glimmer Posts and replay them. There is kind of an underlying life gain strategy to this deck. It's one of these things that I think is very important to the Is-It-Post strategy. It's what allows the decks to get to that mid to late game where they really start to dominate. They want to get to that point to draw out the cards and to really get the mana they need to play the bigger spells and their big finishers. What I think this deck is going to be able to do with a bit of life gain is get it to that mid game where we can start building up that army, that swarm of big sized creatures. Usually you think of a token strategy and you're building up an army of little 1/1 creatures, and kind of the idea here was to put in a lot of creatures, but we're going to be using them at a much bigger size. So we want to get to that point in the mid to late game where we have a lot of tokens on the field. We can use that populate ability really well in order to generate that army. That is partly why I added this little life gain package over here. I am running a full set of Centaur healers. I think it's a great drop. It's a 3/3 for 3, and the holdback really is basically the fact that it requires the 2 different colors of mana, something that should not be too difficult here because we do get prisms and expedition maps as well. But they are a great body. It's a 3/3 creature for 3, and you gain 3 life. You're going to be able to generate a lot of life gain and make a lot of comebacks in this deck thanks to the Rift Watchers and the Centaur healers. Not even getting into the lands here, just on these guys alone. The Rift Watchers, of course, give you a little evasion as well. We are kind of in a metagame that has a heavy Delver presence, a heavy mono blue presence currently, so being able to deal with these flyers is very important. Spire Golem is something that is very hard to deal with. This deck does not have a lot in the way of removal options, but because this has that 3 toughness, it's going to be able to really balance out that block and at least hold it off for a couple of turns. If you look at Green Post, what that does, it does not have a lot in the way of removal spells as well, but it does use combat to do a lot of its control. In a similar means, because we are a bit heavy on the mono blue and the flyers that we do encounter, I did run a set of 3 Penumbra Spiders. Now these provide you 2 things. First off, they do give you that reach wall that is great to deal with. They can be very hard for an opponent to deal with because they do come in at that 4 toughness. But most importantly, what they do is they come back as a creature token when they die. Now, one of the things that I was worried about in Pauper is the ability to generate creature tokens for this populate. Now, Horncaller's Chant, Curses of Chord, and Eyes in the Sky, those generate their own tokens, and these become the better of the populate spells because they not only populate, but they create a token that you can populate off of. If you just draw Tristani's Judgment, you really want to be holding that back until you actually have a creature token on the field, but these 3 will give you that ability. They will create that first token that you need. So Penumbra Spider is in here because of the fact that it is a hard body to get past, and it provides you that reach, as well as the fact that when it dies, it will come back as a token, and then you can, in the worst case scenario, populate off that and create a whole bunch of spider tokens. So that's going to work out really well. I think I'm a little leery on these 3 cards. So we talked about Horncaller's Chant, Curses of Chord, and Eyes in the Sky, and these are the better of the populates because, again, they can create that token. Now, what I'm a little concerned about, and I've played this, and it's one of these hit or miss kind of things. Eyes in the Sky generates that 1/1 token, and what we were trying to get away from here was a swarm of 1/1s. If we want a token on the field, we want it to be a bigger body, a significant creature. We want it to be this 3/3 Centaur. We want it to be a 4/4 Trampling Rhino, or worst case scenario, we want it to be a 2/4 Spider. Having the 1/1 bird is not terrible. It does give you a lot of blocking options for those flyers. And, that evasion is always important as well. However, it's almost necessary in this deck because there are some times that the mana in Cloud Post decks can get a little clunky. So it's easier for you to find this 4 mana and at least get a body on the field. Again, this deck really wants to make it to the mid to late game where it can finally get into itself. It does miss out on a lot of the card draw that you do get with Is-It-Post and when you're running blue, obviously because we're not in those colors, but what it does grant you is that most of the spells that you're going to top deck into will be playable. You can hit a bit of mana ramp, mana flood, but that can be averted a little bit with expedition maps. So I think the Eyes in the Sky, while it's not as powerful as some of these other populate spells, is almost necessary because of the fact that it's where it lies in the mana curve. The last, we talked about the Judgment. I didn't want a lot of control options, but you can't pass up Judgment because of the fact that 1, it exiles, and 2, it populates. You can't get past that. It's a pretty great spell. And anyone who's played Limited with Return to Ravnica is well aware. So the final thing I added is Druid's Deliverance, and it came down to the fact that I had these 2 spots open, and there are a lot of options. You can main deck for populate spells, but I think this had the best advantage because of the fact that we're seeing a lot of the aggro decks out there. This gives you a lot of advantages in game one against things like Storm. Even if they storm off and you can prevent that combat damage from one turn, maybe it'll give you enough of an edge to start building yourself back up. Not necessarily, but you also get a lot of stuff like mono white aggro, Stompy, Infect, all of these things out there. Hexproof is becoming a thing. So I think having those Druid's Deliverance in the main deck is great. As far as my options were concerned for populate spells, we do have some options you'll see in a second in the sideboard, and I did build a sideboard for this. Lastly, this is kind of our standard 8-post package. We're running a full set of Prophetic Prism. This helps us with the mana fixing off of the heavy uncolored base of Mana Pool. We're also running a set of 3 Expedition maps, and I've kind of found my preference is 3. I think that's kind of the sweet spot for Expedition map because of the fact that it does thin your deck while not running into too many. If you draw too many of them, you're thinning your deck a lot. Top decking into Expedition map is not nearly as fun as, drawing into some spell that's way, way more worth it. Excuse me. The Crushers are also standard. While this does generate a lot of token presence, you do need bodies a lot of the time. One of the weaknesses to the Populate strategy is if you do not have any tokens to copy, then these spells become, of course, weaker. There are, like I said, sometimes where you're going to want to hold on to Eyes in the Sky to populate a bigger creature token. So getting these bigger bodies, this provides you with a finisher almost. If you consider a lot of Izzet Post decks and they use things like Rolling Thunder or Karavek's Torch as their finisher, Mono Blue Post uses bigger creatures and their Crushers as their finisher, and further Green Post will use Crushers as their finisher along with the Herds, but it's a big body and that's their finisher. So while we are trying to build this swarm mechanic, I think having 3 Crushers in here was necessary to provide that extra threat on the field that our opponent is going to be able to overlook a creature token or 2 for a couple of turns as he tries to deal with the Crusher. So I think that was definitely a very important part to this deck. So let's take a look real quick at the sideboard I put together. And this is something that's, I don't know, it's almost a mismatch. I kind of wish that there were less 1-ofs and 2-ofs, but this is what we're going to go with for now. This is what I found has been mildly successful. So I'm running obviously a full set of Reap and Sow, and this is a dual purpose. If you look at Green Post, it does use a lot of Reap and Sow in the main deck as mana ramp and land fetch. I'm sorry, that was the same thing. Mana ramp and land destruction. So in the mirror matches against other post decks, it's going to give us that option for the land destruction while ramping us up and giving us a bit of a faster clock. I think it works out really well. Prismatic Strands obviously is a great thing against storm decks and stuff like that. Rootboard Defenses and Sundering Growth were the 2 other populate spells I was talking about when we were talking about Druid's Deliverance. And Sundering Growth is basically a naturalize with populate, and that's well and good. I'm running 3 here for things like the affinity matchup. But what it really lacks is if your opponent is not running those main deck artifacts and enchantments, you're not going to get a lot of options. It's also, like I said, weaker than these spells that generate a token of their own. Rootborn Defenses is great for, I think, the mono black deck. Like I said, one of the weaknesses to the populate mechanic is the fact that if they're killing off all of your tokens, you have nothing to recreate. So Rootborn Defenses gives you an option to kind of prevent some of the kill spells. And that works very well for that. These were kind of the oddballs, I guess. Serrated Arrows I expected to be used for things like Delver. Gives you a lot of great options for killing off those 1/1s. If you hit a Delver before it flips and stuff like that, it works very well. The questionable ones here, I guess, are Guardian of the Guild Pact and Druid's Deliverance. Now, I added a 3rd copy of Druid's Deliverance to the sideboard because, again, I think there are a lot of very strong aggro decks out there right now, and this could be a very useful strategy. I think it could as well be used against Storm. A lot of decks are favoring Grape Shot these days over Empty the Warrens. However, it is still a decent option against most Storm decks because of Empty the Warrens. And Guardian of the Guild Pact, I think, gave us another finisher option. I talked about how the deck can struggle. It doesn't have that red finisher. So Crushers are a great option there, but I think actually Guardian of the Guild Pact will break a lot of creature walls. When you run into this, it's a very common scenario. I see it a lot in limited play, a bit more than other things, but because you are aggro, you run into this situation where if you're facing another aggro deck, you can find yourself sitting across from a whole line of creatures, and you have your own line of creatures, and you're both sitting there waiting for the opportune moment to attack through. And sometimes it's not always clear as to what your best attack is going to be, and it takes a lot of, thought and concentration and careful decisions to make that right play. So I think the Guardian of the Guild pack gives you an option to kind of break the creature wall. If you're against Stompy, and they have a whole bunch of green creatures you can't get through, the Guardian of the Guild pack, at the very least, will be able to get through and do some damage. It will take a while longer, but at least it prevents some of that wall that you run into. I know that being a singleton, the odds of running it and drawing into it, are not going to be fantastic, but I think it still gives you a decent option for doing that. The sideboard, like I said, is something I am going to play a couple example games, go through the replays for you. I'm not going to go through the sideboarding. I kind of addressed it here. I'm not going to show full matches. Save us all a bit of time. Plus, it gives me a chance to show you a bunch of different matchups as opposed to just one match. 3 games against Delver. I can show you a game against Delver, Affinity, and Goblin, stuff like that. So this will give you a chance to maybe get a better shot at that. So we are going to, like I said, put up, there will be a second video here in the article where you can see kind of how the games went. So here you go. I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to leave comments. I think this deck does have a lot of potential as one of those rogues that we do run into time to time. I see the success of Green Post, and I know it does gain at least some advantages off the card draw that it can get off of the herds and stuff like that. But I still think a deck like this does have a lot of potential. And there could be a place for Populate, actually. Maybe I was wrong.